There is a phrase people use all the time when life falls apart: rock bottom. It gets said in movies, in conversations, in motivational talks, and in personal stories. But despite how common it is, very few people actually understand what it means. Because rock bottom is not a fixed place. It is not a universal experience, and it is not even a single moment in time. For some people, it is losing everything they built. For others, it is emotional exhaustion they can no longer ignore. For some, it is financial collapse. For others, it is internal quiet, invisible, and deeply personal. But no matter how it looks on the outside, rock bottom always feels the same in one way. It feels like the end, like there is no further to go, like everything has collapsed to its lowest possible point. But here is the truth most people don't talk about. Rock bottom is not always the lowest point. It only feels like it in the moment, because human perception is limited to what we are currently experiencing. When pain is high enough, it creates the illusion of finality. The mind stops imagining lower. It only registers this is unbearable. And in that state, perspective shrinks, time feels distorted, hope feels distant, and the present moment feels permanent. But rock bottom is not permanent. It only feels permanent when you are inside it. To understand rock bottom clearly, we need to break it down into what it actually is, not emotionally, but structurally. Rock bottom is a psychological threshold. It is the point where coping mechanisms stop functioning the way they used to, where distraction no longer works, where avoidance no longer works, where denial no longer works. And what remains is raw awareness. Not clarity, not peace, but exposure. Exposure to reality without filters. And that is why it feels so intense, because most of life is buffered by coping systems, daily routines, social distractions, internal rationalizations, emotional distancing. But when those buffers collapse, what remains feels overwhelming. Not because reality suddenly changed, but because filters were removed. And without filters, everything feels louder, stronger, heavier. But here is where the misunderstanding begins. Most people assume rock bottom is purely negative, a place of destruction, a failure state, a loss of control. But psychologically, rock bottom is more complex than that, because it is also a stopping point, a forced pause, a moment where forward momentum breaks, and when momentum breaks, something else becomes possible. Awareness, not immediately, not comfortably, but eventually. Because when everything external stops working, the internal system is forced to respond differently, and this is where many transformations begin. Not because rock bottom is good, but because it removes illusions, illusions of stability, illusions of control, illusions of sustainability in patterns that were already breaking down quietly. And those illusions often persist for years before collapse. Which means rock bottom is rarely sudden in origin. It is usually gradual in buildup, like pressure accumulating in a system over time, until the system can no longer maintain equilibrium, and then collapse feels sudden, even though it was building slowly all along. Now, let's talk about something important. Rock bottom is not only defined by external events, it is defined by internal capacity. Two people can experience the same situation, and only one will reach rock bottom. Because rock bottom is not about what happens, it is about what the mind can currently tolerate. And that tolerance changes over time, stress accumulates, resilience fluctuates, emotional capacity shifts, which means rock bottom is not a fixed destination, it is a relative experience. Now, one of the most misunderstood aspects of rock bottom is the idea that it is purely destructive. But in reality, rock bottom often performs a structural function. It ends cycles that would otherwise continue, even if those cycles were harmful, even if they were unsustainable, even if they were quietly damaging long before collapse. Because humans are adaptive. We can live inside dysfunction for a long time if it remains stable enough. We normalize what we repeat, we adjust to what persists, even if it is not healthy. And that is why some systems in life do not change gradually, they only change through disruption. Rock bottom is one form of disruption, But here is where it becomes even more important to understand. Rock bottom does not automatically create change, it creates opportunity for change. Those are not the same thing. Many people hit rock bottom and remain stuck, not because they are weak, but because collapse alone is not transformation. Collapse removes structure, but it does not automatically build new structure, and without rebuilding, the same patterns often reemerge in different forms. So rock bottom is not the solution, it is the interruption, it is the pause before potential reconstruction. Now, let's go deeper into what actually happens psychologically during this phase. When people reach extreme emotional or mental lows, the brain shifts into survival prioritization. It reduces long-term thinking, it reduces abstract planning, it reduces emotional complexity, and focuses on immediate stability. This is why decision-making during rock bottom feels different, smaller, simpler, more reactive, because the brain is not optimizing for growth at that moment, it is optimizing for survival. But once stability begins to return, even slightly, the mind starts to re-engage higher-level thinking. This is where reflection becomes possible, not during collapse, but after it begins to stabilize. And this is where a critical shift can happen, because rock bottom strips away distractions, it reduces external noise, it forces confrontation with what was previously avoided, and although this feels painful, it also creates clarity that was not accessible before. But clarity alone is not enough. Clarity without structure becomes overwhelm, which is why many people describe rock bottom as both the worst and most revealing time in their lives. It removes what was unnecessary, but it does not immediately replace it. Now, let's address another misconception, the idea that rock bottom always looks dramatic. This is not true. For some people, rock bottom is loud, visible, external, a major life breakdown, but for others it is quiet, internal, invisible to everyone else. A slow emotional shutdown, a gradual loss of motivation, a persistent sense of disconnection, no dramatic event, no public collapse, just internal depletion, and both are valid forms of rock bottom. Because again, it is not about scale, it is about capacity. Now, here is something very important. Rock bottom is often the point where identity becomes unstable, because identity is usually built on continuity. I am someone who, I always do this. I handle things this way. But when rock bottom disrupts behavior patterns, identity feels disrupted as well, and that can feel disorienting. Because humans rely on identity for stability. But when identity becomes unstable, there is an opportunity, not immediately obvious, but significant. Because when identity is no longer rigid, it becomes flexible, and flexibility allows rebuilding. Now let's talk about why rock bottom sometimes becomes a turning point. Not always, but sometimes. It is not because suffering automatically creates growth, it is because suffering removes avoidance capacity. When avoidance is no longer possible, confrontation becomes inevitable, and confrontation leads to awareness. And awareness creates the first real possibility of change. But change still requires action, and action requires energy. Which is why recovery from rock bottom is rarely linear. It moves in cycles: awareness, relapse, adjustment, stability, reconstruction, and each stage takes time. Now let's bring everything together. Rock bottom is not a place. It is not a punishment. It is not a moral failure. It is a threshold, a psychological breaking point where old systems stop functioning effectively, and while it feels like collapse, it is actually a transition state. A moment where what was no longer sustainable finally stops continuing, and what comes next depends entirely on what is built afterward. Some people rebuild old patterns, some people repeat cycles in new forms, and some people use the interruption as a chance to restructure completely. But none of those outcomes are automatic. They depend on awareness, timing, support, and willingness to engage with discomfort differently than before. So the truth about rock bottom is not that it is the end. It is that it removes what was already unstable, sometimes painfully, sometimes suddenly, sometimes quietly over time. but always with one underlying effect. It stops what cannot continue. And in that stopping, there is space. Not immediately comfort, not immediate direction, but space. And space is where rebuilding begins, because without interruption, nothing changes. And rock bottom is, at its core, interruption at its most intense form. So when people say, I hit rock bottom, what they are really describing is not finality, it is exposure. Exposure to what was already breaking. And once you see it that way, rock bottom stops being the end of the story and becomes the beginning of something else entirely. Not because it feels good, but because it clears what was no longer sustainable, and what remains after that is where rebuilding begins.